Hi, Year 10. Hope you're all doing well. You've made it nearly anyway to the end of this half term. A very strange one, given that you've not been in school at all. But I can see that in nearly all cases you've been keeping up with the work, and that's really good to see. And it will certainly help once we're back in school and preparing for Year 11 next year. So I hope all your families and yourselves are doing well and keeping cheerful. And I hope you enjoyed this week's poem, which is Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. Thank you for all your comments and questions on it, and for your comments and questions throughout this half term. Let's have a read of the poem. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labour in the weekday weather, made banked flyers blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? Okay, so I think really interesting and memorable poem, and obviously it has in common with BAMP that we looked at last week, that theme of a family member, but the whole mood of this poem is quite different, even though both poems have a complexity in the sense that there's more than one way of responding to the characters of the speaker and to the relative. Just want to start, before we get into the nitty gritty of the poem, with a couple of my favourite comments that people made. Excuse me, gone too far. A couple of my favourite comments that people made this week, and they're here on the screen. So the top one: I really like this poem, although I don't completely understand it. I agree, and actually, I think with a good poem, perhaps that's always where we are. If we don't understand the poem at all, then the poem, or maybe there's been a failure somewhere along the line. But I think the core of a poem is maybe always just slightly out of reach, and it's certainly true of this poem, that is opening up this world of the speaker's life and family, and in some ways giving us lots of specific details, but at the same time hinting at this vast terrain of meeting, which is never kind of really nailed down or specified, and I'll talk about that more. But yeah, I think perhaps if we're saying I really like this poem, although I don't completely understand it, that's always a good position to start from. And hopefully by the end of this video and two parts of the video, we'll understand the poem a little bit more. I also was glad to get the second message that's on the screen. When do you think the poem was set? I find this quite interesting, actually, because this is quite a famous poem, I think, and it's certainly a poem that I feel like I've come across. I don't know when I first read it, but I've come across it at different moments down the years, and particularly the final lines, which we're going to talk about a bit in this first part, are quite well known and sort of stick in your mind. But I don't know if I've ever read previously, I have a little bit this week, anything else by Robert Hayden, so I don't think I would have known the context of the poem at all. And this student here suggested early 1900s. Well, it was a good guess. The poem was first published in 1962, but the poet has said that he is here reminiscing about his own childhood. Not all poetry is autobiographical, but this poem, he says, is at least partly about his own childhood. And he was born in 1913, so we are talking that sort of first part of the 20th century. So far so good. The poet, I'll show you his picture on the screen. It's a black and white picture, but you might be able to tell from that he's a black writer, and he's an African American, black American, and he grew up in Detroit. I don't think I knew that before, and that was quite surprising to me, because there's something about this poem that, for me, I imagined a kind of rural English setting. Maybe it's building up that fire from scratch, which seems quite old-fashioned and traditional and not really what you'd expect in a big city in America. But for what it's worth, he grew up in Detroit, so one of the biggest cities in America, and a city that certainly in the 20th century was the centre of the car industry. So maybe this weekday labour of the father took place in a car factory. It's certainly possible. So that's a bit of context for the poem. I also learnt this week that Robert Hayden was fostered and then adopted. So he, in his early years, moved between a few different households, and then with the parents, including the father who's described in this poem, lived with them for the rest of his childhood. So there's another layer of context, although, as I said, when I replied to this student's message, I do kind of think probably the message of this poem is trying to talk about all children and parents and that relationship and how our perspective on it develops as our lives continue. So here's some other questions that people had about the poem. You can see them on the screen there, and hopefully we'll answer all of those as we go through the poem. But you can see I've put in bold a question that actually I think 3 or 4 people asked about those last 2 lines. So we're going to, in this first part of the video, focus on those last 2 lines and talk about them a little bit, and then we'll go through the rest of the poem in part 2. The exam question that I put alongside the poem, and also the kind of one way of thinking about the poem that I wanted you to do, was ideas and feelings about family life. So before we look at those last 2 lines, I just want to share on the screen here some of the ideas that you came up with. I thought these were really good, and they showed really good understanding of the poem. This is a summary. There's 6 here. They're all direct quotes from people's messages, but you may have said something very similar, and obviously, you know, because of space, I've just used one version of each idea. But you can see there the difficulty of life as a parent, hard work this dad's putting in, the sacrifices, as the second bullet point says, that parents make. And then there's that idea of children's understanding or lack of understanding of that. A couple of them refer to that slow understanding as they grow older, or in the 5th bullet point there, he only now understands how much his father loved him. And then you've got, again, that idea of love. What I think this poem has to do with what love is. It's quite a different kind of love, isn't it? From, if you think way back at the start of this half term, we looked at In Paris With You, and which was the other one? It was Corey in the Winter. So another poem with winter in the title, but certainly a different kind of love. Although I guess you do have in this poem, and a David Tate poem, that idea of a love that's perhaps unrequited, at least at the time. So love in small gestures like the building of the fire, the polishing of the shoes, which might not be noticed by the child when he's younger. Well, that's one thing that last line is all about. What did I know? What did I know of love? So one thing that this last pair of lines is doing is expressing that kind of admission. And I think there's a sense of guilt about it, that he didn't understand when he was younger about his father's love for him and the ways in which that love was expressed. So that's one meaning of the last 2 lines. What do you know when you're younger about love and life and your parents' role in that? But I kind of think there's a lot more going on there as well, and I think that the language actually is really interesting. Here, there's so much you could say about it in an exam, but actually more interesting in the exams. So much to think about here in terms of our enjoyment of the poem and how we might. Some lines in poetry, I think, stick with you, and these are a pair of lines that maybe for some people kind of stay in your head, and you turn them over in your head, and maybe you don't think about them for a few years, but then you think about them again. And so, what kind of things are happening in these lines that would influence what we're thinking about them? Well, first, we've got the repetition, haven't we? I'm going to underline that. I don't think I'm going to try, because as you can see, it's not terribly neat. I'm not going to try and annotate that as I would do in class, but the repetition, what did I know? So just that almost wondering at how, I don't know if naive is the right word, but how how little he understood at that age of his father. He said earlier in this stanza that he spoke indifferently to him. He ignored him almost, or was cold towards him. The father who had driven out the cold. What did I know? That repetition of the question, almost a self-abasement in saying, I totally didn't understand. And then we've talked about the fact it's a question, but the second part of the question, actually this last line, I think is even more interesting because it talks about love. Well, so far, so unsurprising. Lots of poetry talks about love. But I can't think of any other poem that talks about love like this. If I were to say, right, jot down some words to describe love, I don't think if you jotted 10 words down each, all the 31 people in the class, I don't think any of those 310 words would be austere. And I don't think probably any of them will be lonely either. What a really interesting description, or as one student said, such a strong juxtaposition, almost an oxymoron actually. Austere love. If you don't know that word austere, it's got a few different meanings, but some of them are strict, comfortless, plain. And all of those seem almost the opposite of how love is often described in poetry and more generally. So really interesting. And this student talks about, is it his confusion of life? Another person said, is this to do with how harsh life can be, how harsh love and life in general can be? So you've got that idea of love being austere and lonely. So this father's expression of love is a solitary one. We don't hear about the mother. There's a hint of maybe arguments with the mother. It talks about the angers of the house. But we don't hear about her, just the father getting up early on his own and the son staying in bed until he finally comes downstairs, but even then sort of more or less ignores the father. So this loneliness of love, but it's still love, and he still keeps going. One student said that this poem, I thought was a really insightful idea, was about the endurance of love. And that's what we've got here. This love that is plain and unadorned, there's nothing showy about it, but it endures, it keeps going. And actually, the poet published this poem when he was, nearly 40. One person suggested, was it after his father had died? I don't know, but you could see how that might work, that you'd think back on these times and feel guilty. But that love of the fathers, while it might have made limited impact at the time, or the son didn't think about it at the time, it endured into adulthood. So this austere and lonely love, I think that's a really interesting description. And then you've got love's austere and lonely offices. Another, I guess maybe the old-fashionedness of this phrase is one thing that made me think the poem was even older than the first part of the 20th century. So what are offices? Again, in the comment I shared before on the next page, let me get to the right page, talks about the dullness of life, maybe thinking about an office as in a place where you go to work. So rather unhappy idea of the future. At the minute, the son's getting everything done for him, but this is what he's got to look forward to, this done, dull, and sort of unthanked life that the father lives. Well, offices here, which is linked to the same idea, means either service for another person or the duties linked to a role or a job. So here you've got the father's service of the son and also the duties involved in being a parent. And that fits in really nicely with what lots of you said about parental sacrifices, the offices of love. So here, love is seen as something that isn't necessarily transcendent and uplifting and free, but something that is a hard job, a sacrifice, something that isn't beautiful or magical, but something that's plain and strict, austere. And love as a kind of austerity is, as we said before, kind of a juxtaposition. But nevertheless, this love is strong and it's something that lasts. I'll see you again in part 2.